Hello, and welcome to the Deb Calvert channel on Bright Talk. I'm Deb Calvert, and I'm really excited to spend a little time with you here today. I am going to be presenting 12 topics in 2019 that are all about effective management and being more effective interacting with members of your team, no matter what sort of job function or job title that you might have. And we have a really diverse audience signed up for this webinar today. So I'm going to try to keep this topic broad enough so it has universal application for everyone. One way that you can help me make sure that I get your needs met is by posting any questions or comments that you have for me along the way. And if you are not listening live, if you're one of the many people who come in later to listen on demand, well, I encourage you to connect with me on LinkedIn or to email me directly, and let's make sure we get your questions answered too. So that's an open invitation. For those who are new to Bright Talk, just a couple of logistical considerations. First of all, if you have any technical difficulties during the presentation, click that button that says Get Live Support Now. That's the Bright Talk tech team, and they'll do a much better job for you than I'll be able to during the presentation in getting your needs met for anything technical. I want you to be sure and notice that there's an attachments and links button that you can push. If you drop that down, you're going to see a whole host of different types of bonus content that I've added there for you. And I encourage you to take advantage of all of that. I'd really like you to take whatever you need to get the most out of our time together. At the end of the presentation, if you can take just a few seconds to write me a little note or review, I appreciate that. That'll help me make sure that each and every time I come back to you that I'm doing things a little bit better. Okay, so now let's get down to business. In today's workshop, the first in this 12-part series, I'm going to focus on this topic of improving communication. And since communication involves both sending messages and receiving messages, we'll talk about the responsibilities each party has in effective communication. And we'll drill down to talk about improving listening skills and improving effectiveness in delivering messages in ways that people can receive them loud and clear. So let's see, I probably ought to introduce myself just a little bit more. As I said, I'm Deb Calvert. I am personally going to be presenting all 12 of these topics in the series. I've held a variety of roles in HR corporate, in the sales function and operations functions, and I've been in business for 13 years working with organizations with HR and every other functional area as a coach and as a consultant. Okay, back to business. So let's just start right here with the basics. Communication is defined as the process of transmitting information and a common understanding from one person to another. And the key word there is common. It signifies that both the sender and the receiver understand the information that's been transmitted in the same way. And this is the very heart of communication. In fact, the word itself, communication, it's derived from the Latin word communis, which means common. Without common understanding, there is no communication. Of course, in any communication, there are two parties. There's the sender, that's the person who initiates the communication, and then there's the receiver. That's the person or persons to whom the message is being sent. It all begins when the sender encodes an idea by selecting words and gestures or symbols or expressions to convey that idea. And what I'm describing here, this applies to all verbal, nonverbal, and even written language. Now then, communication continues as the receiver decodes the message into meaningful information. The way that information is transmitted is known as the medium or the channel. Right? Mediums include face-to-face conversations, telephone calls, email, text, or written words. Selection of an appropriate medium for transmitting your message can be really critical to the effectiveness of your communication. And then there's one more factor we have to take into account. There's also noise. Noise interferes with our communication. Noise is anything that distorts your message. That could include different perceptions of the message due to language barriers or interruptions or emotions or any biases we bring to the conversation or any preconceived notions or attitudes. So the quality of the communication depends on the encoding of the message, the decoding of the message, the medium chosen for delivery of the message, and the noise that could potentially interfere with the message. And effective communication is a two-way process that requires little effort and even some skill by both the sender and receiver. That's why I've illustrated the process that you see there on screen is going both directions and with both parties being senders and receivers. Okay, now we're about to do a deeper dive into both sets of those responsibilities, the senders and the receivers. But I want to start with a high-level overview of the chief responsibilities that each party has. The receiver is responsible for being open and receptive to the message, and then responsible for checking to make sure the message was received and understood. And the sender is responsible for delivering the message as clearly as possible and for checking to make sure the recipient understands what has been conveyed. I often get the question, if there's a conversation happening between a manager and a direct report in the workplace, does the manager have a higher level of responsibility? And I've come to the conclusion, my own opinion, that yes, the manager does in fact have a little more responsibility because it's the manager who needs to be certain that there's clarity for everybody involved. It's the manager's role to get work done through others, and it's unfair to expect others to do the work or to do it correctly if the communication hasn't been effective. Having said that, though, for everyone, I just think it's smart to operate as if you are in control. You can't control what your manager does. You can hope for the best. You can ask for the best. But ultimately, you have to ask for what you need. You have to make sure that you've got the communication and that you understand it too. So that's my answer to that question. All right, receiver responsibilities. Now, I know for many of you, what we're covering here so far, it seems very basic. It might even seem obvious. That's because we do know how to communicate effectively, but we don't abide by these guidelines and best practices when we're caught up in the day-to-day work that can sometimes swamp us. So although much of this presentation is going to serve as a reminder of how to communicate effectively, I'll also be weaving in some techniques that will be new and useful for you too. So when you are the receiver of a message, one thing you can do is, of course, try to focus in on it without any distractions. That would mean that you'd be eliminating distractions, even the ones inside your own head, that keep you from giving your full attention to the sender. We seem to think that we can multitask when receiving communications, but studies reveal that most of us are not nearly as capable as we think we are at doing two things at once. Now, of course, you also have a responsibility to be receptive and to make it easy for the sender to convey information to you. You can help by putting the speaker at ease. Look and act interested. Be interested. Don't be too quick to interrupt or cut off the sender. It also makes it easier for the sender to effectively communicate when you make that effort to understand what's being said and why it matters. Put yourself in the sender's shoes. Whenever you hear an important message, be curious. Wonder things like, what feelings accompany this message? Well, what is this sender's point of view? You don't have to agree with it, but you can try to understand it. Now, anytime you're not clear about what's being communicated, your responsibility as a recipient is to ask for clarification. Even when you think you understand, it's a really good idea to paraphrase and repeat what you received, and then to ask, did I get that right? You may notice that most of these responsibilities for the receiver are linked to listening skills, and that's absolutely right. So let's go ahead and spend some time discussing how to improve your listening skills. When you engage in passive listening, and by that term what I mean is listening that's not fully and actively engaged, listening that's just barely one step up from hearing. When you engage in that kind of listening passively, it's usually pretty obvious to the speaker. It shows up as a limited acknowledgement by the listener, or it could even take the form of inappropriate acknowledgement. Your cues that you're putting back don't quite match what's being said. Now, there are 4 ways that you can acknowledge what you're hearing. So to get beyond passive listening, the first things you can do are to tune in so that you are acknowledging what you're hearing. The first of those 4 types would be verbal. A verbal acknowledgement is you using words to affirm that you've heard something. You might, for instance, say, oh, that's interesting. Tell me a little more about that. Second way that you can acknowledge what you're hearing is nonverbal. That would be any kind of body language. An example would be leaning in to show interest. And then there's rational acknowledgement. This is focusing on anything that is a logical response. When we offer a solution, for example, to a problem we're hearing about, that's a rational response. And then there's an emotive response. That's an acknowledgement that lets the speaker know that you hear and you sense the emotions that are being expressed. You might say something like, I can tell this is really bothering you. Now, we want to make sure that you're acknowledging in ways that are appropriate and that fit the situation, so that's why you don't want to rely too much on merely passive listening. On average, I think this is an interesting little factoid, on average, people in a business setting can pay attention for no more than 60 seconds without being distracted by an unrelated thought. And for many of us that attention span is closer to about 30 seconds. You've been here with me for a little over 10 minutes. What this means is that you've had at least 10 mental distractions since I started talking. And that's okay. That's human nature. But it does beg the question, why is it so difficult to listen and to give that full attention that we want to give people? Maybe it's because we don't think of listening as a discipline or a skill. We do routinely confuse hearing with listening, and that in and of itself is a barrier. But if you think about going through school, we're not really ever taught the skills of listening. Maybe you took a speech or a communications class in middle school or high school, but even there, you learned how to speak and not how to listen. So listening is a skill that's underappreciated, and that leads us to this place where it's no wonder that it remains underdeveloped and underutilized for many of us. Not only that, but we typically do not listen with an open mind because we're hardwired to build on past experience. Our brain remembers and responds to what's familiar. That's why we make assumptions and judgments and big leaps when we're listening to someone talk about anything that's even a little bit familiar. Your brain gets in the way of listening because it races to make those connections instead of keeping you focused. And then, unfortunately, it seems like sometimes communication becomes a contest. Who can be the the loudest, the sharpest, the fastest talker versus who can hear and understand the best. We certainly do. If you think about business meetings, for example, we place a much higher value on speaking than we do on listening. And then there's the fact that listening happens inside our heads, and that also makes it difficult. We get lazy because, well, who knows if we're really truly listening? We know how to put on our listening face and do the head bobbing and the as we normally do when we're only halfway listening. We think we can get by. But there are so many really powerful benefits of listening. We ought to shift gears to explore now why it would be worth the extra effort despite those obstacles that get in our way. See, listening it's essential to earn the right to comment on and be involved with other people's issues or concerns. We absolutely must listen effectively and be perceived to be listening well before we can proceed with any advising or any asking for support. Cutting to the chase without having earned the right to do so will usually be interpreted as arrogance or selfishness. Listening signifies that you are interested in and perhaps even willing to enter into the speaker's world. By showing this willingness, we differentiate ourselves from others who don't listen as well. And not only that, but listening, good listening with empathy especially, is the beginnings of trust. Let me challenge you to do something. Think about someone you trust, someone you really, really trust. And as you're thinking about that person, consider this. Do the reasons that you trust them include that they listen to you and try to understand you? My guess is yes. We do begin to trust people more when they listen to us better. Not only that, but when you really listen to someone, you also benefit by gaining some knowledge and some insight into that person and whatever subject they're talking about. When we listen well, we don't miss key points. We don't end up glossing over the stuff that we think we already know because our brain's working against us. And at the same time, as you're listening well, you'll be making the speaker feel important and appreciated and respected. When you listen and the speaker knows that you are listening, ultimately, you'll understand each other better. The speaker will likely open up to you more, and that will increase the depth of your relationship, and it will minimize misunderstandings and potential mistakes and crossed wires down the road. I'll bet you can think of some additional benefits based on your own experience. Better listening leads to better relationships and fewer problems. Now, the opposite of good listening is bad listening, and I'm going to start there. Poor listeners exhibit certain behaviors, and I've posted those here on screen for you. As you're looking at that list, give yourself an honest self-appraisal, a mini assessment as you gauge your own behaviors. You can use this list as a starting point to eliminate habits that keep you from being a good receiver of communication. And let me offer just a little bit of comfort here. You're not alone. No matter which one of these bullets you picked, these are all widespread behaviors, especially in this age of mobile devices and at a time when we're inundated with messages from every medium all day long. I don't say that to excuse you from making an effort to become a better listener, but just so you know, you're not alone, and everybody has a little bit of work they could do to become a better listener. By contrast, these are the behaviors of good listeners. These are the behaviors and habits that you'll want to build as you replace the ones that were on the previous screen. And by the way, if you want to get these slides and have this information so that you can use it later, I did include an attachment, a PDF of the slides, so that you can take that and work with it later on. Okay, so now back to these good listening habits. This is an overview. I'm going to take you through a few of these points in the upcoming slides to help you develop actual techniques and behaviors that will improve your active listening. But before we move into those specifics, I'm going to pause. I want you to have a moment to take stock of your listening strengths. Those strengths are what you'll want to build on to become an even better receiver of communication. I won't be covering all of these, but I'm going to cover most of them and give you some tips for whichever one you might want to work on, whichever ones are not already your strengths. We'll start at the top. Here are 5 quick tips for getting clarification on something that you hear. That clarification, that's part of active listening. It's the only part of active listening where you're going to be doing the talking. What you'll do is you'll paraphrase, which I know, sometimes that feels awkward for the person who's doing the paraphrasing. It can feel a little bit artificial, like you're being a parrot. But these repeated words that you give back to the sender, that's like pure gold. We all love to hear our own words from someone else's mouth, and we love the feeling of knowing that we've been heard and understood. So don't worry too much about that awkwardness. If there's something that you don't understand, you need to say so. Questions to deepen your understanding. After you paraphrase, you might also ask a question like, did I get that right? Or maybe you'd say, what did I miss? Or am I understanding this fully? And it's perfectly fine. It's perfectly respectful to state when you need clarification. Just say, hey, could you say that? And as you do, you'll even be helping the sender improve the way they encode their messages. You'll be modeling what they should do if they don't understand your messages either when you're the sender. In some situations, you'll also need clarity on more than the stated facts. So that's why you might need to ask questions or check into any of the emotional tone that you've heard. It's not a bad idea to check in too on how urgent something is or where it falls on the list of priorities. Go into a conversation thinking about how to get what you need from that conversation. And this last tip on this slide, it might be the toughest. Don't assume that you understand. Don't assume that the way it used to be is the way that it is now. And don't assume that you have everything you need. Instead of assuming, just try to get full clarity. Remember, your objective is to understand, so take charge and get what you need to have full understanding. I want to pause here and thank the folks who are posting comments along the way. I really appreciate those. They're helping me to steer what I share with you. And if you have questions, be sure and post those for me too. Okay, I'm going to continue with some tips for better listening. Here's a good one. For me, this has been one that has really, really helped me a great deal in business. I said a little while ago that it's important to hear what is being said as well as how it's being said. And that matters because true understanding is always contextual. Emotions provide context for content and vice versa. You're not getting a full picture if you're missing the associated feelings. What you see on screen there are 6 sort of emotion involved in the message. The sender is encoding the content and the feelings too. Your job as receiver is to decode both of them in the complete message. Now, you might think that it's not your job to read between the lines or to encourage emotions in the workplace. You may expect the sender to do that work, the opposite way, to take the emotions out and to be very plain spoken and to the point. But here's the problem. The sender probably won't do it. We're all human, first and foremost. So emotions are going to come, and when they do, try to be empathetic. Even if you don't express that empathy, just know that having the empathy, that means putting yourself in the other person's shoes. It's about letting the speaker feel felt. When you can do that, it will help you to reduce the risk of misunderstandings, and it will make you a better listener. You'll be picking up on a lot more. Now, for those of you who may struggle with racing thoughts or being distracted because your brain is able to process information so much faster than people can speak it, here's a tip for you, if that's the case, for keeping yourself tuned into the conversation. Listening for what's different will keep you engaged and keep you attentive to the conversation longer. Listening for what's different instead of pouncing on what's similar or familiar will help you avoid making assumptions. It'll delay your interruptions and your comparisons. You see, in your own brain, contrasts take longer to process and require more cognitive understanding. So if you focus on purpose to look for contrasts and what's different instead of what's familiar, you're going to save yourself a lot of time, and you're instantly going to become a better listener. And when you listen for differences and contrasts, you'll have a deeper level of understanding. It's going to take you beyond what you already know or expect and assume. Now, this one, I've got to go here. As basic as this may seem, this topic would not be complete if we didn't talk about how to declutter your environment and eliminate as much noise as possible so you can listen better. And these are just super simple, obvious tips that can help you avoid getting distracted. You probably could have drawn up a list just like this, but I'm including them here because there's a difference between we can do them and we actually do them. So I've got to point out that every single thing on this list is a behavioral choice. There's nothing to learn here, but there is something for you to do here. Each of these are ways for you to ennoble the sender. Every one of these choices signals that you see the sender as important enough to listen to and to dedicate time to. Now, the last but not least thing that you can do as a listener is you can draw more out from the sender. You can get some details, and you can get a more complete picture when you encourage the sender to tell you more. So these are techniques for yielding the floor to the speaker. When there's something that's important for you to understand or something that might be difficult for the sender to open up about, you want to use these techniques for encouragement. Remember, these aren't necessarily easy to do because we have this higher value that's been placed on speaking rather than listening. So we might not do these things naturally. You don't ever want to do them in a way that's inauthentic, but you do want to use them to draw your speaker out and to make it safe and open for that dialogue. Now, I'm going to close on the topic of listening because we've got to talk about sender responsibilities too, but I loaded up a bunch of different items for you in the attachments and links. There's an infographic about listening. There's an ebook. And, I got to tell you about this one. There is a listening assessment that I am newly certified as a practitioner in using that assessment. And so on that one, I've given you enough information that you can sort of understand the assessment, but if you want to actually take the online assessment and get a full profile of your own listening habits, plus some coaching about what you can do with that, well, then just mention this webinar when you email me, and I'll do all of that for you at half price. It'll be $250, and if you have a group of people, we can look for some bulk discounts. I'll do it at half price, individual or for the group. Okay, sender responsibilities. We're shifting gears now. I want to talk about the responsibilities of the sender. Really important to note this point. Disseminating your message is not enough. Remember, the point of communication is getting the other party to understand what you want them to know or do. That means, as a sender, that you're responsible for sorting out what you want to say before you say it. Take time, especially with your really important messages, to get clarity for yourself about the main idea. In addition to that, you want to use a medium that's going to be effective in communicating your idea. Don't rely on convenience or expediency or the most comfortable thing that makes it easy for you. Consider the medium that will help you achieve your objective of a received and understood message. And then this next one, this is an important reminder too. Your body language, your tone, your facial expressions, your word choice, all those things need to match. Your actions related to the message also need to be aligned with the message. Otherwise, you can really confuse your receiver. And then finally, the important messages need to be repeated multiple times. You'll want to communicate about the important stuff over and over and over again until other people are saying it too. It's going to feel like over-communication to you a long time before it feels that way to others. To be effective in getting actions and outcomes and to make sure that the receiver is responding to you, you might choose to use these 9 simple tips for persuasive speaking. These all work, by the way, whether you're communicating to a group or to an individual. Since a lot of explanatory, I'm just going to talk about a few of these bullet points. On this slide, let me just talk about one of them. When you want to persuade others and you are trying to mobilize people into action, it helps to use an active voice instead of a passive voice. Because an active voice with active verbs and a person, the subject doing the action, that helps people to visualize and crystallize the action so that they can go out and do it too. Let me give you an example. If we say something like, a plan will take shape for us, that's passive. I don't know who's doing it. I don't know what the action is. It seems like there's just going to be some magic, mystical thing that happens, and this plan will take shape for us. Much more effective would be to say, together we will create a plan. Now I know there's an action and there's an outcome, and I know who's involved. It's you and me together. So try to speak in active voice if you want your receivers to hear you loud and clear. When we hear people speaking in that more passive tone, it sounds like, without them ever intending it, it sounds like they have a commitment or a clear idea about what's happening or what needs to happen. Those active voice verbs make you more persuasive and engage people much more effectively. So let me just give you a few words that are going to help you be persuasive. In the English language, these are some plain, simple words that are very persuasive. And the reason they are persuasive is because they show me, the listener, how I can benefit. They appeal to my most basic human needs in a way that doesn't need an explanation. I don't need to envision something. Instead, I have an automatic response. Of course, you don't want to overdo this. Your objective isn't to load these words up and promise something that you can't deliver. These words are absolutely not meant to be used to manipulate others, but where it's authentic and where you can offer personal benefits and show people how they could be helped by your idea or your plan, well, then you certainly should seize that opportunity. Using these words and coding your message using these words makes that message easier to send and easier for the recipient, the receiver, to pay attention to and to understand and to take seriously. It helps them to do the decoding. Now, here's a slightly more advanced strategy for persuasion. This is one when you send your message that's going to put a powerful tug into your message. A lot of leaders use simple analogies or metaphors to paint a picture. And this is a technique that's been around for centuries. By comparing one thing to another, you make it familiar. You make it relatable. And that makes it more comfortable. The ones that you see on screen, these are very powerful examples because they evoke emotions by painting pictures. They transcend words alone because they conjure pictures and they portray experiences. When you send messages that resonate with people, that makes you a more effective communicator. Here's another one. You can also send messages that cause people to sit up and to take notice. Effective communicators make declarations that no one else would ever dare to make. Leaders and effective communicators are willing to share their vision by speaking it in a way that everyone can understand and everyone can see themselves in it. When these declarations, the ones that are on screen now, when these declarations were made, they seemed like fairy tales. That someone saying it, somehow that made each of these ideas more tangible and more attainable. And people got behind these powerful declarations to bring the sender's words to life. Declarations start with the words, I will, or we will. Those are powerful words. They add oomph to your statements, and they let the receiver know that you're really serious. Now, you can also make promises. When you make promises, you'll want to be careful. You don't want to overpromise. You don't want to underpromise. You want to be accurate, and you want to manage your promises. To be credible, you need to make sure that you also deliver on their promises. So if you ever have to break a promise, you do that with integrity. It's not a surprise that blindsides anyone. They've been seeing, you've been communicating all the way along what's changed or what's gotten in the way of fulfilling that promise. You can also make requests. When you're communicating, instead of issuing commands, maybe it's a request. That helps you to gauge where the other person stands, and it facilitates some two-way discussion. Making a request is a form of sending a message, but it's one that invites the receiver to make a choice in the way he or she responds. So don't use this one. Don't use this technique of a request unless the other person really will have a choice. That's just a way to mess things up in the communication and to confuse everybody involved. You can make assertions too. Leaders sometimes communicate by making bold assertions. A bold assertion is a way to anchor your position. It's a way to put something out there, whether it's fact or opinion. It's a way to give somebody an opportunity to react, to respond, to see where you stand, and then to navigate around that. And don't forget good old body language. Nonverbal communication can ignite gut-level reaction and emotion. Research shows that acquiring an understanding of body language increases your ability to be successful in collaborating and communicating. So you want to be aware of your own body language and what you're conveying. Okay, we've got some great questions coming in. I'm answering them as they come, and I'll save a couple here till the end. As you're using all of these techniques, don't forget about this one. This is just one more thing we need to cover. I've mentioned this a few times before. Whether you're the receiver or the sender, asking questions is a powerful tool, really powerful tool for communicating more effectively. Questions also build rapport and trust. They show our interest in others. They show our desire to understand them. When you craft questions that are open-ended, you're signaling that you'd like to have a very full and complete answer. When you give a command statement, that's not a question at all, but it says, hey, tell me more about that. That's where you're going to get the biggest, widest open answers. A command statement completely yields the floor to the other person. Now, you're going to want to communicate through your questions by signaling what you want. A closed-ended question that can be answered yes, no, you just want a short answer. Open-ended or command, you're yielding the floor to someone else. And you can use all of these techniques to empower the person who is listening to you and to make sure that you are being understood and to be effective in getting all of the information, the two-way dialogue, fully participated in so that everybody benefits from the conversation. Okay, we covered an awful lot here, and this is just part one in a 12-part series of all kinds of different ways that you can make yourself more effective. I hope you're going to jump into the attachments and links and sign up to join me in my next presentation on this channel. Coming up in this series, we'll be covering topics like conflict management. We'll be covering topics like how you can step into your full presence as a leader at any level to be more compelling in anything you choose to communicate about. We're going to cover a whole gamut of topics that are all about you in the workplace and how you can be more effective as a member of a team or as a manager. I've given you tons of resources. Here's one more on screen now. I really do want to continue communicating with you. You could read our blogs. You can join our community. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. You're welcome to email me. Just be sure to let me know what you need, because that's the way that I'm going to be able to bring back in each one of these sessions exactly what you're looking for. This is the last call for questions. The question I want to be sure to answer that's just been posted is, how do you know if you're being effective at communicating? I think it's a great question. I think the first and best check, if you are the sender, is to ask the other person to repeat back what you've said. Now, you're not going to teach them like talk to them like they're a child, but you would just say something like, I want to be sure that I was clear here. I feel like I gave you a lot of information. Why don't you kind of recap that for me so that I hear it back and make sure I didn't miss anything? Right? You're taking the responsibility, but you'll know that you've been effective if the recap is a reasonable match for what you intended it to be. The other way you know you've been effective if you are the recipient of the information, the receiver, is to paraphrase back and to check for understanding. And you kind of already know in your own head, because if you're missing things, if you felt yourself being very, very distracted, you can sort of tell if you are effective or not. Okay, it looks like there aren't any more questions, but it's an open invitation for those coming in on demand. Email me those questions later on. Thank you very much for spending this time with me. If you take another few seconds to leave a review for me, any comments, things you'd like to see in the future, I greatly appreciate that. Good luck to you and all your new techniques that you're going to try to make your communication more effective.